On alighting from their carriage, the two sovereigns were received by the Grand Duke of Weimar and his son, the hereditary Prince Charles Frederick, the King of Bavaria, the King of Saxony, the King of Württemberg, Prince William of Prussia, the Princes of Mecklenburg, the Prince Primate, and the Duke of Oldenburg awaited them at the entrance of the salon. The Emperor had in his train Prince de Neuchatel, Prince de Benevento, the Duc de Friaul, Grand Marshal of the Palace, General Calancourt, Duc de Vicenza, the Duc de Rovigo, General Lauriston, aide de camp to His Majesty, General Densouty, First Equerry, Chamberlain Eugène de Montesquieu, Count de Beausset, Prefect of the Palace, and Monsieur Cavaletti. The Emperor of Russia had with him the Grand Duke Constantine, Count Tolstoy, Grand Marshal, and Count Ogorovsky, aide-de-camp to His Majesty. The chase lasted nearly 2 hours, in which time 60 deer were slaughtered. The space these poor beasts had to cover was enclosed by canvas, so that the monarch could fire at pleasure without disturbing themselves sitting in the windows of the pavilion. I've never in my life seen anything more absurd than this kind of hunting, but those who practice it gain the reputation of being skilled marksmen. Great skill, to be sure, to kill an animal that the huntsmen take by the ears, so to say, and set in front of the gun. The sight of the Emperor of Russia was very poor, and his infirmity had always deterred him from an amusement which otherwise he might have liked. On this day, however, he had an inclination to try it. He expressed the wish, and the Duc de Montebello at once handed him a gun. Monsieur de Beauterne had the honor of giving the Emperor his initial lesson. A stag was hustled within some 80 paces of Alexander, who brought him down with the first shot. After the hunt, their majesties repaired to the palace of Weimar. The deigning Duchess received them as they alighted from their carriage, followed by all her court. The Emperor affectionately saluted the Duchess, recollecting that he had seen her 2 years before in very different circumstance, of which I have spoken in its proper place. The Duke of Weimar had asked the Grand Marshal, Duc de Friaul, for some French cooks to prepare the Emperor's dinner, but His Majesty preferred to eat in the German style. Their Majesties admitted to their table the Duke and Duchess of Weimar, the Queen of Westphalia, the King of Württemberg, the King of Saxony, the Grand Duke Constantine, Prince William of Prussia, the Prince Primate, Prince of Neuchatel, the Duke of Oldenburg, the hereditary Prince of Weimar, and Prince of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. After the dinner, there was a play and a ball, the former at the town theater, where the ordinary comedians of His Majesty played La Mort de César, and the latter at the ducal palace. Alexander opened the ball with the Queen of Westphalia, to the great astonishment of everybody, for it was known that this monarch had never danced since his accession to the throne, a reserve thought very praiseworthy by the elders of the Russian court, who believe that a sovereign is too high placed to share the tastes and take pleasures in the amusements of the commoner sort of men. For that matter, there was nothing to scandalize them at the Duke of Weimar's ball. People did not dance. They promenaded in couples while the orchestra played marches. The next morning, their majesties went in a carriage to Mont Napoleon, near Jena. A splendid breakfast was ready for them under a tent which the Duke of Weimar had set up on the very spot where the Emperor had bivouacked the day of the Battle of Jena. After breakfast, the two emperors climbed up a wooden pavilion which had been constructed on the Mont Napoleon. It was very large and had been decorated with plans of the battle. A deputation from the city and the University of Jena went thither and was received by their majesties. With the deputies, the emperor entered into great details concerning their city, its resources, and the manners and character of its inhabitants. He questioned them as to the approximate value of the damages which might have been inflicted on the people of Jena by the military hospital, which had so long remained in permanence amongst them. He wanted to know the names of those who had suffered most from the conflagration and the war, and gave order for gratuities to be distributed among them. The small proprietors were to be completely indemnified. His Majesty informed himself with interest of the condition of the Catholic worship, and promised to endow the presbytery in perpetuity. He granted 300,000 francs for their chief necessities, and promised to give still more. After visiting on horseback the positions which the two armies had held on the eve and the day of the Battle of Jena, as well as the plain of Espolda, in which the Duke had arranged a shooting match. The two emperors returned to Erfurt, where they arrived at 5 o'clock in the evening, almost at the same time as the hereditary Grand Duke of Baden and the Princess Stephanie. During the whole time of the excursion made by the two sovereigns to the battlefield, the emperor had been extremely obliging in giving explanations to the young Tsar, which the latter listened to with an equally extreme curiosity. His Majesty seemed to take pleasure in developing before his august ally and in the presence of the sovereigns surrounding them, firstly, the plan which he had formed and followed at Jena, and afterwards the various plans of his other campaigns, the maneuvers which he deemed the best, his habitual tactics, and in fine, his ideas on the art of war. The emperor in this way bore the whole brunt of the conversation during several hours, and his audience of kings paid him as much attention as pupils eager to learn give to the instructions of their master. When His Majesty returned to his apartment, I heard Marshal Berthier say to him, "Sire, are you not afraid that the sovereigns may someday turn against you? All that you have just been teaching them. Your Majesty seems to have forgotten what you have sometimes told us, namely that we ought to act with our allies as if they were later to become our enemies." "Berthier," replied the emperor, smiling, "that is a courageous observation on your part, and I thank you for it. I fear, God forgive me, that you must have thought me a rattle-pate. You think then," pursued His Majesty, seizing one of the Prince de Neuchâtel's ears, "that I have been silly in giving them the whips with which they may come back and scourge us? Don't be alarmed. I do not tell them everything." The table of the emperor at Erfurt was semi-elliptical in form, and the upper end, and consequently at the rounded part of this table, their majesties were seated to left and right of the sovereigns of the Confederation according to their rank. The side opposite their majesties' places was always vacant. There remained standing the prefect of the palace, Monsieur de Beausset, who relates in his memoirs that he one day listened to the following conversation. That day, October 7th, the conversation turned on the Golden Bull, which, up to the establishment of the Confederation of the Rhine, had served as constitution and regulation for the election of emperors, the number and quantity of the electors, etc. The Prince Primate entered into some details concerning this Golden Bull, which he said was made in 1409. The Emperor Napoleon called his attention to the fact that the date he assigned to the bull was not exact, and that it was proclaimed in 1336 under the reign of Emperor Charles IV. "True, sire," responded the Prince Primate. "I was mistaken. How does it happen that your Majesty is so well acquainted with such things?" "When I was a simple second lieutenant of the artillery," said Napoleon. At this beginning, there was a movement of very marked interest on the part of the illustrious guests. He resumed smiling. "When I had the honor to be a simple second lieutenant of the artillery, I was in garrison for 3 years at Valence. I cared little for society and lived in great retirement. A happy chance had lodged me near a bookseller who was learned and obliging. I read and reread his library during those 3 years in garrison, and having forgotten nothing, even matters bearing no relation to my position, nature, moreover, had endowed me with a memory for figures. It often happens when my ministers that I cite for them the details and numerical total of their oldest accounts." Some days before his departure from Erfurt, the emperor gave the Cross of the Legion of Honor to Mr. de Piggy, commandant at arms of the place, to Mr. Wegel, burgomaster to Jena, and Messrs. Wieland and Goethe, and to Mr. Stark, senior physician at Jena, to General Count Tolstoy, ambassador from Russia, recalled from this post by his sovereign to be employed in the army, the grand decoration of the Legion of Honor, to Dean Memung, who had twice said mass at the palace, a ring of brilliants with a cipher and crown, and 100 Napoleons for the 2 priests who had assisted him, and finally to the Grand Marshal of the palace, Count Tolstoy, the fine Gobelins tapestries, Savonnerie carpets, and Sèvres china, which had been brought to Paris to furnish the palace at Erfurt. The ministers, great officers, and officers of Alexander's suite received magnificent presents from His Majesty. The Emperor Alexander acted in the same manner towards the persons attached to His Majesty. To the Duke de Vicence, he gave the broad ribbon of St. Andrew and the plaque of the same order and diamonds to the princes of Benevento and Neuchatel. Charmed at the talent of the French comedians and chiefly with Talma, he sent fine presents to him and all his companions. He complimented the actresses and the director, Mr. Dazincourt, whom he did not forget in his largesse. The interview at Erfurt, so dazzling for its illuminations, wealth, and luxury, terminated October 14th. All the great persons whom it had attracted thither left between the 8th and 14th of the month. On the day of his departure, the emperor gave audience after his levee to Baron de Visson, envoy extraordinary of Austria, and remitted to him a letter for his sovereign. At 11 o'clock, the Emperor of Russia came to see His Majesty, who received and showed him out again with the greatest ceremony. Shortly afterwards, His Majesty repaired to the Palace of Russia, accompanied by all his court. After mutual compliments, the two sovereigns entered a carriage and did not leave each other until they had reached the spot where they had met on arriving on the road to Weimar. There they embraced affectionately and separated. At 9:30 in the evening, October 18th, the emperor was at St. Cloud, having made the entire journey incognito. Book 3, Chapter 1. His Majesty remained but 10 days at St. Cloud, and of these he spent 2 or 3 at Paris for the opening of the legislative session at noon, October 9th. He set off a second time for Bayonne. The Empress, who to her great grief could not accompany His Majesty, sent for me the morning of the departure and renewed in accents of the most touching solicitude the advice she was accustomed to give me whenever the Emperor made a journey. The Spanish character alarmed her and caused her to fear for her husband's life. The farewells were painful and afflicting. The Empress wished to go along. The Emperor had all the trouble in the world to make her comprehend that it was impossible. Just before starting, His Majesty re-entered his dressing cabinet for a moment and told me to unbutton his coat and vest. I obeyed and saw the Emperor pass around his neck between his vest and shirt a ribbon of black taffeta from which was suspended a sort of little sachet the size of a large hazelnut covered with black taffeta. I did not know at the time what was contained in this sachet which the Emperor always wore. Thenceforward in all his campaigns later on, I shall have a sad occasion to say to what end he did so. I set off with a heavy heart the recommendations of Her Majesty the Empress, fears which I did not try to conceal from myself, and the fatigues of reiterated journeys contributed to my sadness. A like sentiment betrayed itself on nearly every face of the imperial household. The officers were saying that the wars of the North were a mere bagatelle in comparison to that to be fought in Spain. November 3rd, we arrived at the Chateau de Mirac. 4 days later, we were at Vittoria in the midst of the French army. There the Emperor found his brother and some Spanish grandees who had not yet deserted his cause. The arrival of His Majesty electrified the troops, and a share of the enthusiasm they manifested, a very small share, it is true, found its way into the heart of the king, who regained some courage. We were en route almost at once to establish ourselves provisionally in Burgos, which was carried by main force and even pillaged for several hours because the inhabitants had abandoned it, leaving to the garrison the care of delaying the French as long as possible. The Emperor lodged at the Archbishop's Palace, a superb building erected on a large place where the grenadiers of the Imperial Guard bivouacked. This bivouac was a curious sight to see. Immense cauldrons found in the convents, filled with mutton, fowls, rabbits, etc., were suspended over a fire which was fed with furniture, guitars, and mandolins, while the grenadiers, pipe in mouth, gravely seated in gilded armchairs, upholstered in crimson damask, watching their cooking and exchanged conjectures concerning the campaign that had just but begun. The Emperor rested 10 or 12 days at Burgos, then gave orders to march upon Madrid. We could have gone by way of Valladolid, the road being even finer and safer on that side, but the Emperor wished to carry the pass of Somosierra, an imposing position fortified by nature which had always been considered impregnable. Situated between 2 perpendicular mountains, this position defended the capital. It was guarded by 12,000 insurgents and 12 pieces of cannon, placed in such a way as to be capable of doing as much damage as 30 or 40 anywhere else. Assuredly, there was enough to arrest the most formidable army, but what could then oppose any obstacle to the progress of the emperor? We halted in the evening of November 29th, 3 leagues from this formidable defile in a village called Bazagias. It was very cold. The emperor, however, did not go to bed. He spent the night writing in his tent, wrapped in the police given him by the Emperor Alexander. Towards 3 o'clock, he came to warm himself at the bivouac fire where I was sitting, not being able to endure the cold and dampness of a low room assigned to me in which I had nothing to lie in but some handfuls of dirty straw. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the position was attacked and taken. The next day, we arrived before Madrid. The emperor established his headquarters in the Chateau at Champmartin, a pleasure house of quarter of a league from the city, which belonged to the mother of the Duke de l'Infitado. The army camped around his house. The day after arrival, the owner came, bathed in tears, to ask His Majesty the revocation of the fatal decree which outlawed her son. The emperor did all he could to reassure her, but could promise nothing, the measure being general. There was some trouble in taking the city in the first place, because His Majesty had recommended the greatest moderation in the attacks, not wishing, as he said, to restore a burnt city to his brother. And in the second place, because the Grand Duke of Berg had fortified the palace of the Retiro during the sojourn at Madrid, and the Spanish insurgents had established themselves there and were defending it courageously. The city was not otherwise protected, for it had nothing but a wall very much like that of Paris. But at the end of 3 days it was taken. But the emperor would not enter it. He continued to reside at Champmartin, with the exception of one day when he visited the royal palace and the principal quarters incognito and in disguise. The respect which the Spaniards have always displayed for all things that belongs to a king, whether they consider him legitimate or not, is an extraordinary thing. When King Joseph left Madrid, the palace was closed and the government established itself in a good enough building which had served for the males. But that time no one entered the palace but the domestics employed to clean it occasionally. Not a piece of furniture, not a book was displaced. The portrait of Napoleon at Mont Saint Bernard, one of David's masterpieces, still hung in the grand reception room, and that of the queen opposite, precisely as the king had had them placed. Even the cellars were religiously respected. The apartments of King Charles had likewise remained intact. Not a watch of his immense collection had been touched. An act of clemency on the part of His Majesty towards the Marquis de Saint-Simon, a Spanish grandee, signalized in a very affecting manner the entry of the French troops into Madrid. The Marquis de Saint-Simon, a French émigré who had been in the service of Spain since the emigration. He was in command of a part of the capital, and the post he defended was precisely opposite that which the emperor occupied at the gates of Madrid. He resisted long after the other chiefs had surrendered. The emperor, impatient at always hearing discharges from his side, gave orders for a vigorous charge in which the Marquis was made prisoner. In his bad temper, the emperor sent him before a military tribunal, which condemned him to be shot. The sentence was about to be carried into execution when Mademoiselle de Saint-Simon, a charming young person, came to throw herself at the feet of His Majesty, who at once granted her father's pardon. The king immediately re-entered his capital. With him returned the high families of Madrid, whom the troubles had driven from the hotbed of insurrection and balls, fetes, festivities, and plays presently began again. There was at this time in the principal theater a very pretty young person, not more than 15 or 16 old at most, with black tresses, sparkling eyes, and a ravishing bloom. She had been able, so at least people said, to guard her virtue against the attacks to which it was exposed by her profession as an actress. She had a fine mind, a good heart, a singular vivacity of expression, everything. In fact, she was adorable. So said to His Majesty one day to Monsieur de B, who had been at the theater the night before and who had returned from it in a state of amazement. Madame de B added that this young girl had neither father nor mother, that she lived with an old aunt, that this aunt, at once avaricious and depraved, guarded her with special care, affected the strongest attachment for her, eulogized the charms and qualities of her dear child wherever she went, in the hopes of soon founding her fortune on the liberality of some rich and powerful protector. So engaging a portrait, having made the emperor express the wish to see this beautiful actress, Monsieur de B ran to the house house of the aunt with whom he presently came to terms, and that evening the niece was at Chamartin, adorned in a dazzling style and perfumed with all the perfumes imaginable. I've already said that the emperor had a very pronounced aversion for odors, and he did not fail to manifest it when I brought this poor girl into his chamber. She doubtless had expected to give His Majesty great pleasure by thus covering herself with essences. However, she was so pretty, so attractive, that the emperor found this antipathy diminish while looking at her. It was nearly 2 hours since I had left the chamber when I heard the bell ringing hard enough to break the cord. I went in as fast as I could and found no one but the young woman. The emperor was in a dressing coat, his head leaning on his hands. "Constant," he cried on seeing me, "take that little thing away. She's killing me with her odors. It's insupportable. Open all the doors and windows, but take her away first, and be quick about it." It was very late to send away a woman in that style. However, the order admitted of no reply. I went therefore to acquaint the poor little thing with the intentions of His Majesty. At first she did not understand me, and I was obliged to repeat several times, "Mademoiselle, His Majesty desires that you should withdraw." Then she began to weep, entreating me not to send her out at such an hour. It was of no use for me to tell her that I would take all needful precautions and provide a soft and closely covered carriage. Her prayers and tears did not help, and she only consoled herself a little when I showed her a valuable present which the emperor had given me for her. On my return, I found the emperor still sitting in his dressing room and dabbing his temples with cologne water. He leaned on me to go and lie down again. The emperor left Chamartin December 22nd, going towards Astorga with the intention of meeting the English, who had just disembarked at Corunna, but some dispatches remitted to him at Astorga by a courier from Paris determined him to resume the road to France. Hence he ordered a departure for Valladolid. We found the road from Benavente to Astorga horribly covered with corpses, dead horses, artillery wagons, and broken carriages at every step. We met detachments of soldiers with torn uniforms, barefoot and without weapons. In a word, in the most deplorable condition. These wretches were all fleeing towards Astorga, which they regarded as a port of safety and which would soon be unable to contain them all. It was frightful weather, the rain falling hard enough to blind one, and I was in bad health and suffered greatly throughout this painful journey. While at Tordesillas, the emperor established his headquarters in the outbuildings of the convent of Santa Clara. The abbess of this convent was presented to His Majesty. She was more than 75 years old, and from the age of 10 had never left the house. Her mild and intelligent conversation pleased the emperor much. He asked what he could do for her and granted her several favors. We arrived at Valladolid January 6, 1809. There was still a very lively commotion reigning there. 2 or 3 days after our coming, a cavalry officer was assassinated by some Dominican monks. Hubert was one of our comrades, passing through a lonely street one evening, was set upon by 3 men and grievously wounded. They would doubtless have killed him if some grenadiers of the guard had not heard his cries and ran to his assistance. Again, they were monks. The emperor, violently irritated, had the Dominican convent searched. The body of the officer was found in a well amidst a considerable heap of bones, and the convent was suppressed by the order of His Majesty, who for a moment thought of extending his rigorous measure to all the convents of the city. He reflected, however, and contented himself with requiring all the monks in Valladolid to appear before him on the appointed date. They came, not all of them, but deputations from each convent to prostrate themselves at the feet of the emperor, who covered them with reproaches. Several times he treated them as assassins and brigands, saying that they ought to all be hanged. These poor men listened in silence and humility to the terrible language of the irritated victor, whom nothing but their patience could appease. Finally, the emperor quieted down. Doubtless, it occurred to him that it was insanely to browbeat kneeling men, not one of whom breathed a word in reply. He left the group of officers surrounding him and went forward in the middle of the group of monks, motioning them to quit their suppliant posture. And these good men, while obeying him, kissed the skirts of his coat and pressed around him with an eagerness which did not fail to excite some fears in the members of His Majesty's suite, for it is certain, had there been a Dominican among these religious, nothing could have been easier than an assassination. While the emperor was staying at Valladolid, I had a quarrel with the Grand Marshal, which I shall remember all my life, and in which the emperor intervened in a very just and kindly manner in my favor. These are the circumstances. The Duc de Friaul met me one morning in His Majesty's apartment and asked me in a very brusque tone, for he was extremely hasty. If I had had the service of the open carriage made ready, I answered with much respect that the service was always ready. 3 times the Duke repeated the question, raising his voice higher each time, and 3 times I made the same reply. The same was like, if, he said at last. So you don't understand? That happens apparently, monsieur, because your excellency explains it so badly. Then he spoke to me about a new carriage which had arrived from Paris that very day and which I knew nothing about. I was about to reply to his excellency, but without being willing to listen to me, the Grand Marshal went out shouting, swearing, and apostrophizing me in terms to which I was not at all accustomed. I followed him as far as his apartments in order to have an explanation, but on reaching his door, he entered it alone and slammed it rudely in my face. Nevertheless, I went in a few minutes later, but his excellency had forbidden his valet de chambre to introduce me, saying that he had nothing to tell and nothing to hear from me. Unaccustomed to such freaks, I went, almost beside myself, into the emperor's chamber. When his majesty entered, I was still so moved that my face was wet with tears. His majesty wished to know what was the matter, and I recounted the quarrel just thrust upon me by the Grand Marshal. You are a baby, said the emperor to me. Come yourself and have the Grand Marshal told that I wish to speak to him. His excellency lost no time in complying with the emperor's invitation, and it was I who announced him. See here, said the emperor, pointing to me. Look at the state you put this poor fellow in. What had he been done? What had he done to be treated like that? The Grand Marshal bowed without replying, and with a rather dissatisfied air. The emperor went on by calling his attention to the fact that he should have given me his orders more clearly, and that a man was excusable for not obeying, such as are unintelligibly given. Then, turning to me, his majesty said, Mr. Constant, be sure that will never occur again. The simple fact gives the answer to many false estimates that have been formed of the emperor's character. Doubtless there was an immense distance between the Grand Marshal of the palace and a simple valet de chambre of his majesty, and yet the marshal was reproved for wrong done to the valet de chambre. The emperor was profoundly impartial in the administration of his domestic justice. Never was the interior of any palace better governed than his own, because there was really no master there except himself. The Grand Marshal bore a grudge against me for some time, but as I have already said, he was an excellent man. His bad humor soon evaporated, and so thoroughly that on our return to Paris he asked me to be his proxy at the baptismal font for a child of my father-in-law, who had asked him to be its godfather. The godmother was the Empress Josephine, who kindly selected my wife to represent her. The Duc de Friault did things with as much nobility and grandeur as good grace. After that time, and I love to do this justice to his memory, he eagerly seized every opportunity of being useful to me and of making me forget the chagrin his vehemence had caused me. I felt ill, if I had to lead, with a rather violent fever. Some days before His Majesty's departure, on the day set for it, I was at the height of my sickness, and the Emperor, fearing lest the journey might prevent, or at least retard my recovery, forbade me to be told, and set off without me, recommending the persons with whom he left me at Valladolid to be careful of my health. When they found me somewhat easy, they told me that His Majesty had departed. I was unable to contain myself longer, and in spite of all the doctor could say, of my own weakness and everything else, I insisted on being put into a carriage, and off I started. It was well I did, for hardly had I left Valladolid 2 leagues behind me when I found myself better, and the fever left me. I arrived in Paris 5 or 6 days after the Emperor, at the moment when His Majesty had appointed Count de Montesquieu Grand Chamberlain, replacing Prince de Talleyrand, whom I met every day, and who did not seem to me in the least affected by this disgrace. Possibly he was consoled for it by the dignity of Vice Grand Elector, which had been conferred on him in exchange. Chapter 2. The Emperor reached Paris January 23rd. He spent the rest of the winter there, with the exception of a few days at Rambouillet and Saint-Cloud. On the very day of his arrival, although he must have been much fatigued by a journey almost without break from Valladolid, the Emperor visited the buildings of the Louvre and the Rue de Rivoli. His mind was occupied by what he had seen of the Palace of Madrid, and his new instructions to Monsieur Fontaine and the other architects sufficiently proved his desire to make the Louvre the most beautiful palace in the world. His Majesty subsequently asked for an estimate on the Chateau de Chambord, which he wished to give to Prince Neuchâtel. Monsieur Fontaine reported that it would cost 1.7 million francs to render it inhabitable, the buildings being in a pitiable condition. It had scarcely been touched since the death of the Marshal de Saxe. His Majesty spent 2.5 months of this sojourn in cabinet business, which he seldom left, and always with regret. His amusements, as usual, were concerts and the play. He loved music passionately, above all Italian music, and like all great amateurs, he was hard to please. He would have been glad to sing himself if he only could, but his voice was the most incorrect it could possibly be imagined, which did not prevent him from occasionally humming fragments of melodies that had pleased him. It was generally in the mornings that he was addicted to these little reminiscences. He used to regale me with them while I was dressing him. The air I heard him murder most frequently was the Marseillaise. The air of Marlborough, whistled by His Majesty, was for me a certain announcement of a near departure for the army. I remember that he never whistled so much and was never so gay as when about to set out for the Russian campaign. His Majesty's favorite singers were Crescentini and Madame Grassini. I saw Crescentini make his debut at Paris in the role of Romeo in Romeo and Juliet. He came preceded by the immense reputation of being the first singer of Italy, and he justified it completely in spite of all the prejudices he had to overcome. For I still remember all that was said of him before he made his appearance at the Court Theatre. According to all the so-called connoisseurs, he was a brawler, devoid of taste and method, a maker of absurd runs and variations, a cold and unintelligent actor, and 1,000 objectionable things besides. He knew when he came on the stage how ill-disposed his critics were, but he did not betray the least embarrassment. His noble bearing agreeably surprised those who were expecting, on hearsay, an awkward and ill-shaped man. A flattering murmur greeted him, therefore, and so electrified him from the first act. He captured all suffragists, movements full of graces and dignity, a perfect knowledge of the stage gestures, moderate and in perfect accordance with the dialogue, a countenance on which every shade of passion depicted itself with the most surprising verity. All these rare and precious qualities gave to the enchanting accents of this artist a magic of which it is impossible to give an idea to those who have not heard him. The interest he awakened grew in intensity with every scene, but at the third act the emotion and rapture of the spectators became a frenzy. In this act, played almost entirely by Crescentini, this admirable singer communicated to the soul of his hearers all the heartbreaking pathos of a love expressed by a delightful melody. By all that sorrow and despair can grasp in sublime music. The emperor was enraptured, and he gave Crescentini a considerable gratuity, accompanied by the most flattering tokens of the pleasure he had experienced in listening to him on that day, as on every occasion when they have played together since. Crescentini was admirably seconded by Madame Grassini, a woman of superior talent and possessed of the most astonishing voice ever heard on stage. She and Madame Burleigh then shared the favor of the public. The same evening, or else on the day following Crescentini's debut, the French stage met an irreparable loss in the person of d'Azincourt, who died when barely 60. The illness of which he died had begun on his return from Erfurt. It was long and painful, and yet the public, to whose pleasure this great comedian had so long contributed, never inquired for him until his illness was beyond remedy and in his last agony had begun. Formerly, when an esteemed actor, and who had better merited esteem than d'Azincourt, was long absent from the stage on account of sickness, the parterre was accustomed to manifest its regrets and make daily inquiries concerning the invalid. At the close of each performance, the actor whose business it was to make the announcements for the succeeding day would read to the assembly the bulletin of his comrade's health. It was not so for d'Azincourt, and the parterre displayed ingratitude towards him. I liked and sincerely esteemed d'Azincourt, whose acquaintance I had made some years before his death. Not many men have deserved better than he, or knew better how to conciliate esteem and affection. I will not speak of his talent, which rendered him the worthy successor of Préville, whose friend and pupil he was. All of his contemporaries must remember how Dazincourt played Figaro. But I will speak of the nobility of his character, his generosity, his tried integrity. His birth and education would seem to have removed him from the stage. Circumstances alone impelled him thither. He was able to guard himself against the temptations of his position. Behind the scenes, amidst the intrigues of the green room, he remained a well-bred man of pure morals, received in the best society, which he delighted by the piquancy of his wit, as well as by his good manners and urbanity. He amused people without reminding them that he was a comedian. At the end of February, His Majesty went to establish himself for a time at the Élysée Palace. It was there, I think, that the contract of marriage was signed between one of his lieutenants, Marshal Augereau, recently made Duke de Castiglione, and the daughter of an old superior officer, Mademoiselle Borlante Chavanches. It was there also that the imperial decree was issued, which gave the Grand Duchy of Tuscany to Princess Eliza with the title of Grand Duchess.